The young man in the expensive suit draped his overcoat across the empty seat beside the old man and didn't apologize for it. The elderly passenger in the grey wool jacket glanced at the coat, then looked up once, briefly at the young man who was already dropping into the window seat across the aisle, already pressing his phone to his ear, already talking. He moved his arm to give the overcoat more room, turned toward the window and watched Ontario sliding past in long grey sheets. Flat fields, bare November trees, the occasional farmhouse standing alone under a white sky. That was how it started on the 115 Via Rail out of Toronto. His name was Irving Macrae, 78 years old, white-haired, with the kind of face that had been weathered not by complaint but by weather, by actual weather, by decades of it, by cold that bit and heat that baked and rain that soaked through everything. He was travelling light. One small carry-on bag in the overhead rack, a folded newspaper on his lap he hadn't read yet, and a cup of Tim Hortons coffee going cold in the cup holder because he'd bought it out of habit more than thirst. He was going to Montreal to see his daughter Beth. She'd been asking him to come for most of the autumn. He'd kept putting it off, not wanting to be a burden, not wanting to take up space in her life that was already full. His wife Eleanor had been gone 4 years now, and Irving had grown accustomed to being the sort of man who didn't need much. A small apartment in Hamilton, a routine, the Legion Hall on Thursday evenings, where some of the men knew him and most didn't. He'd bought an economy ticket. The train was nearly full. Leave a comment if you believe quiet service still deserves to be seen. Callum Driscoll, 28 years old, was not in economy by choice. His business class upgrade had been overbooked, a fact the Via Rail agent had delivered with what Callum described to his phone as completely unacceptable, and so he was here in car 4, wedged between a woman with a toddler 1 row ahead and an old man who'd immediately started looking out the window like the countryside was something worth noticing. Callum was mid-deal, a commercial property in Griffintown, a buyer who kept moving the goalposts, a partner in Vancouver who wouldn't stop texting. He spread his laptop open across his tray table, his briefcase propped against the seat back in front of him, his coat on the empty seat, his elbows out. He needed room to think. He wasn't here to make friends. Irving understood that. He understood the kind of person who needed to expand into any available space, who wore entitlement the way other people wore a watch, so naturally they'd stopped noticing it. He'd served with a few, he'd outranked a few. He knew the type burned hot and faded fast, and the wisest thing you could do was not be in the way when they did. So he moved his arm, he kept to the window, he let the coat have the seat. 20 minutes out of Union Station, Callum finished one call and immediately began another. His voice carried in the way that voices in quiet train cars always seem to carry, not shouting, just entirely indifferent to everyone else. An older woman 2 rows ahead turned around once and looked toward the noise, then turned back without saying anything. The mother with the toddler angled her body slightly away, pulling her child closer by instinct. Irving kept his eyes on the window. 30 minutes in, Callum stood to reach something in the overhead bin, and his elbow caught Irving's newspaper on the way back down, sending it to the floor. He sat back down without looking, didn't reach for it, didn't acknowledge it, just settled back into his seat and typed something on his laptop. Irving bent slowly and picked it up himself. The attendant came through with the drink cart. Irving asked for water. Callum waved her off without looking up, then called after her, "Actually, wait. Do you have anything better than this?" He gestured at the menu card with 2 fingers. "The coffee on this train is terrible, I'll tell you that. No offence." He said it in the way that meant he was entirely comfortable giving offence. The attendant smiled the smile that people who work in service learn to wear like armour. She offered him what was available. Callum made a noise and went back to his screen. Irving watched his own coffee cup steam faintly and said nothing. The real moment came 40 minutes into the journey, just past Kingston. A woman in her 60s had been standing in the aisle beside Callum's row for close to 2 minutes, her roller bag behind her, looking at the seat with his coat on it. The train was moving. There was nowhere obvious for her to go. She asked politely if that seat was taken. Callum looked up, looked at the coat, looked at her. "I'm using it." The woman blinked. "Your coat is using it?" "I've got papers. I've got things spread out." He gestured vaguely at his own tray table. "There are seats farther back." Irving turned from the window. There aren't, he said quietly. I came through the train. The last 2 cars are full. Callum looked at him then, fully for the first time. The look lasted only a second, but it was the kind of look that measured and dismissed in the same motion. I wasn't asking you, old-timer. The woman said, I'll find somewhere, and began to move her bag. Irving had already risen slightly, offering his own window seat, when Callum reached over without looking and pulled his coat back, dropping it across his own lap. Fine, sit. He said it the way you'd say it to a dog. The woman sat. She looked at Irving and gave him a brief, tired nod, the nod of someone who had learned to take small mercies without making a fuss about them. Irving sat back down. Callum's voice filled the car again 10 minutes later. Another call. Something about a zoning variance, a city councillor who was being difficult, a deadline that was someone else's problem. He laughed at something his contact said. A laugh too large for the space, bouncing off the low ceiling of car 4 while the bare trees outside blurred past. Irving closed his eyes. He didn't sleep. He never slept well on trains anymore, hadn't since the 90s, when train rides had sometimes been the only quiet available, and he'd learned to use them differently. To inventory things, to account for what had happened and what still needed doing. Old habit. He inventoried now. Beth's address written on a card in his breast pocket. Her partner David's name, which he sometimes forgot when nervous. The medication Eleanor used to remind him to take with food, which he now had to remind himself. He thought about the woman who had said, I'll find somewhere, in that particular voice, the voice of someone who expected to be turned away. He'd heard that voice before, in other contexts, on other people, in places far removed from a Via Rail coach car in November. It sat badly with him, not because of what Callum had done, he could dismiss that easily enough, but because of how quickly the woman had accepted it, how practiced her acceptance was. He kept his eyes closed. The train swayed through a long curve, and Callum's elbow came off his armrest and knocked into Irving's arm. Callum didn't say anything, just resettled himself and kept typing. Irving opened his eyes and watched the St. Lawrence begin to appear between the trees, wide and gunmetal grey. Running alongside them now, that old river, older than anything any of them would ever be. The woman seated beside him, the one who had taken Callum's coat seat, was younger than she'd looked standing in the aisle. 30s maybe. She had a canvas tote bag printed with a university logo and a notebook open on her tray table, and a folder of printed pages and photographs. Research, it looked like. She'd been working quietly for the better part of an hour. She reached for something in the folder and a photograph slid loose and drifted to the floor between their seats. Irving picked it up. He started to hand it back without looking at it. Then he looked at it. It was a black and white photograph, clearly archival, grainy in the way of images taken under difficult conditions, in a hurry, by someone whose hands may not have been entirely steady. A row of Canadian soldiers in a tree line crouched low. UN armbands. Croatia, from the look of the terrain. He recognized that terrain the way you recognize the face of someone you once knew very well and haven't seen in 30 years. He held the photograph a moment longer than he meant to. Thank you, the woman said, reaching for it. Then she glanced at his face and something shifted in her expression. She looked down at the photograph, then back at him. Then at the small, worn PCLI cap badge pinned to the lapel of his grey jacket, the one he'd worn every day for 15 years without particularly thinking about it. Excuse me, she said carefully, is that Princess Patricia's? Irving looked down at his lapel as though he'd forgotten it was there. Yes. Were you? She stopped, turned the photograph over to check the notation penciled on the back, a cataloguing habit, turned it face up again. I'm sorry, my name is Danielle O'Coy. I'm a documentary filmmaker. I've spent the last 2 years working on a film about the Medak Pocket. Irving said nothing for a moment. September 1993, Danielle continued, keeping her voice low. 2 PPCLI, the Canadians who held the buffer zone in Croatia when the Croatian army pushed into the sector and tried to force them out. The car had not gone quiet. Callum was still at his laptop. The toddler had started making noise up ahead. The river outside kept moving, indifferent and wide. Irving looked at the photograph she was still holding. He reached over and touched the edge of it, not taking it, just indicating. That's the tree line on the approach to Sector South, he said. We held that position for just under 15 hours. Danielle's pen had stopped moving. Were you there? I was the company sergeant major. She set her pen down entirely. Master Warrant Officer Irving Macrae, he said. It was not said proudly. It was said the way you say a name you haven't spoken aloud in a long time, carefully to see if it still fits. Danielle stared at him. Then she reached into her folder and produced a second photograph. A wider shot, a group of soldiers, dirty, clearly exhausted, some sitting, some standing, taken after something had ended rather than before it began. She pointed to a figure at the left edge of the frame. Irving looked at the younger version of his own face and felt the particular strangeness of being confronted with who you used to be. The Croatian forces had moved into the pocket and were killing people, Irving said, his voice even and low. Civilians, Serbs who hadn't evacuated. We were ordered not to engage, which is a hard order to hold when you can hear it happening 200 meters away. He paused. The men held. Then the Croatians turned their weapons on our position, trying to push us back. We held that too. Callum Driscoll's call had ended. In the way of loud people in quiet spaces, his silence was as noticeable as his noise had been. There were men wounded in that position, Irving continued. He was not looking at Callum, he was not looking at Danielle, he was looking at the river. I brought them back through the line myself, 3 of them. The third one was heavier than he looked. I remember thinking at the time that it was a strange detail to be fixed on. But you notice strange things. Danielle had tears standing in her eyes. She blinked them back with the discipline of someone who had learned that crying in the middle of a subject's account helped neither of them. The government classified most of it, she said quietly. For years. People in this country still don't know what happened there. People don't know, Irving agreed. He said it without bitterness. That was the most striking thing about it, the complete absence of bitterness. You've never spoken about it, publicly? Eleanor always said I should. A pause. My wife, she passed 4 years ago. He looked at his hands in his lap. I kept meaning to get around to it. Callum Driscoll had not touched his laptop in several minutes. He was not on his phone. He sat very still in the way of someone who has started listening, and does not want to be caught at it, staring at the back of the seat in front of him. The woman beside Irving, the one who had been turned away from the seat, who had sat quietly through the last hour of the journey, had her notebook closed on her lap. Danielle reached into her folder one more time and found a page of her own handwritten notes, citations from military records obtained through access to information requests, a partial service file assembled over 2 years of searching. She found the line. It says here that your commanding officer recommended you for the Star of Military Valor, that the recommendation was reduced to a meritorious service medal as part of the broader suppression of the Medak Pocket's public record. She looked at him. Is that accurate? Something like that, Irving said. I don't have it framed anywhere. It's in a box. Callum's chair made a small sound as he shifted his weight. Sir. Danielle said the word with a weight it doesn't often carry, and 2 or 3 people nearby looked over without meaning to. I don't think you understand what it would mean. To the men I've already interviewed, to the families of the ones who didn't come home, to anyone who wears that uniform, to hear this told in your own words. I'm just going to Montreal, Irving said, to see my daughter. I know, she smiled, but after that. Irving Macrae looked at this young woman with her photographs and her folder full of other people's history, and he thought about Eleanor, who had told him more times than he could remember that presence wasn't the same thing as burden, that some stories needed the person who had been there to tell them, because no one else could do it right and no one else had the standing to try. He took a card from his breast pocket and set it on her folder, his name, a phone number, nothing else. Danielle held it with both hands. Callum Driscoll had been looking out his own window for a long time. He cleared his throat. He looked across the aisle. I didn't know, he said. He aimed the words at the window, which is where people tend to aim the sentences that cost them something. Who you were, what you'd done. Irving turned and looked at him. Is that something that should have mattered? He didn't ask it to wound. He asked it the way you ask a real question, because you want to know if the person across from you has thought about it. Callum's jaw moved. No answer came out. I'm an old man on a train, Irving said. That's all you needed to know about me to behave the way you did. You didn't need my rank or my regiment or what happened 30 years ago in a sector most people have never heard of. He looked at Callum steadily, not unkindly. "Son, I'm not angry at you, but I'd like you to think about something. Every single person in this car has a life you know nothing about. Every one of them is carrying something you can't see." He glanced at the woman beside him, the one who'd been told to find another seat, who had been carrying that particular tiredness all the way from Toronto. "The woman you turned away from that seat has been on her feet since before 6 this morning, and she is trying to reach her mother's house before dark." He did not know that precisely, but he knew people, and he knew tired, and he knew the hands of someone who had been moving all day without quite enough to show for it. "You looked at her and saw an inconvenience. You looked at me and decided I didn't matter." "I'm sorry," Callum said. The words were quiet enough that the rest of the car probably didn't hear them. They sounded like he meant them. "I know you are," Irving said. "You're not a bad man. You're a young man who hasn't needed to think very hard about other people yet. That will change. Life will see to it." He turned back to the window. "Make sure you're paying attention when it does." The woman who had been turned away from the seat looked down at her hands, and then looked up again, and something in her face had shifted. The careful, contracted expression of someone who expects to be overlooked gone slightly softer. Callum Driscoll did not open his laptop again for the remainder of the trip. The train came into Montreal Central just before 5. The light through the high station windows was the particular blue-grey of late November in Quebec, the kind of light that makes everything look slightly older than it is and slightly more worth looking at. Irving gathered his newspaper and his bag from the overhead rack, moving carefully. His knees were worse in the cold, and the cold had been coming on for weeks now. Danielle helped him lift the bag down, both hands, without being asked. At the door of the car, Callum was standing in the aisle. He stepped back when he saw Irving coming and stood very straight, not quite at attention, but something in that direction, the unconscious posture of a person who has just learned something about what attention is actually for. "Have a good visit, sir," he said. Irving nodded once. "Take care of yourself, son." On the platform, Beth was waiting near the gate in her yellow coat, scanning the crowd the way daughters scan crowds for fathers who are slower than they used to be. When she saw him, she came forward quickly and hugged him the way Eleanor used to, fully both arms, like she was satisfying herself that he was still there. "You look tired, Dad." "I'm fine, Long Ride." He squeezed her arm. "I'm glad to be here." She linked her arm through his, and they walked through the station together, past the high windows and the pigeons and the sound of announcements, in French and English, woven together into something that was almost music. She asked about the journey. He told her it was fine, mostly. He told her he'd met an interesting young woman making a film. He didn't tell her about Callum Driscoll. Some things you carry for a while and set down privately when you're ready. He thought about it later, though, when Beth's apartment was warm and something smelled good on the stove, and the window looked out over rooftops going white with the first proper snow of the season. He thought about the photograph in Danielle Okoy's folder, that row of young soldiers in a Croatian tree line, holding a position the world wouldn't know about for years. He thought about the third man he'd carried through the line, who had retired as a major in Alberta, and who sent Irving a card every November without fail, the same card, the same 2 lines. "Still here because of you. I think about it every day." He thought about what he'd said to Callum on the train. He hadn't planned it. He never planned what he said anymore. He'd given up on speeches around the same time he'd given up expecting recognition. He'd said what was true. That was usually enough. Callum Driscoll would think about that train ride for a long time. Not loudly, not to anyone who'd listen. He would think about it in waiting rooms and in lineups, and in the moments when he was about to wave someone off, or talk over someone, or take up more room than he'd been given. He would feel the particular discomfort of knowing he had been measured by someone who hadn't been trying to measure him and found wanting. That feeling would stay. It would change things slowly in the way that slow things last. Irving Macrae would let Danielle Okoye tell his story, eventually. Not for his own sake, he remained genuinely convinced he hadn't done anything the other men in that tree line wouldn't have done in his place, but for the ones who had stood with him, for the ones who had come home carrying things nobody wanted to hear about, for the ones who hadn't come home at all. He would sit in front of her camera the following spring, in a room in Hamilton with Eleanor's photograph on the shelf behind him, and he would tell it straight. No performance, no decoration, just what happened, and when, and who was there. When Danielle asked if there was anything he wanted to say directly to whoever would be watching, Irving was quiet for a long moment. "I think I'd say this," he told her at last. "Everybody you walk past has done something you'll never hear about. Could be something hard, could be something brave, could just be something they kept doing long after it stopped being easy." He looked at the camera the way he'd looked at Callum across that train aisle, steadily, without anger, wanting to be understood. You don't have to know what it is to treat them right. That's the whole of it. You don't have to know. Beth called that evening after the interview to ask how it had gone. "Fine," he said, "it went fine." "Did you talk about Mum?" "A little." "Good." Her voice was warm. "She'd have wanted people to know about you." He looked at Eleanor's photograph on the shelf, at the woman who had spent 42 years telling him that taking up space was not the same as being a burden, and he felt the particular ache of having been loved by someone who saw you more clearly than you saw yourself. "I know," he said. "I'm getting there." Outside, spring rain came down over Hamilton in long, quiet sheets, and Irving Macrae stood at his window and watched it, the grey wool jacket hanging by the door, the small PP Sly badge catching the light from the street, worn down to almost nothing, still there, still holding.